So you might have heard that the streets of Iran have erupted into massive protests over the last several weeks that now are threatening to blossom into full-scale revolution. In response to this, the Iranian regime have greatly restricted access to the internet, to cell communication, and reportedly periodically blacked out electricity in parts of the country. Now, when a government restricts access to communication and visibility, it usually means a few pretty obvious things. One, when they limit people's ability to communicate with one another, they limit their ability to plan and organize. Two, limiting your people's ability to communicate to the outside world usually means you're planning on doing some really bad things and you're trying to avoid the really bad press that comes hand in hand with those things. Now, reports are already surfacing of arrests and injuries and deaths as a result of the government crackdown. Of course, due to a complete lack of clarity and a vast abundance of propaganda pulling in all sorts of different directions, those reports vary very wildly. I've seen numbers as low as 42 civilian casualties and as high as several thousand. Probably neither of those are accurate. Now, obviously, due to the abundance of propaganda, the internet really disagrees about what's actually happening here, and I'm seeing two major narratives beginning to form. One, this is a grassroots movement on behalf of the Iranian people to finally throw off the shackles of an authoritarian, theocratic regime that has clung to power for the past several decades. Two, this is a coup being orchestrated by Israel and Western interests in order to topple the Iranian regime and install a puppet regime willing to serve the Western status quo. So which one is true? My opinion is both. Both of those things definitely seem to be happening at once. Mossad, the CIA, MI6, agencies like that are definitely on the ground and on the internet sowing discontent, stoking flames, and trying to manipulate this situation to unfold in a way that benefits not only them, but giant Western corporate interests. Because that's what they're always doing. That's literally what they're for. They're literally doing that everywhere in the world, all of the time. Donald Trump has already kind of pre-invited himself to get involved by threatening to fight back should the Iranian regime's authoritarian police forces start killing civilians as a result of civil unrest. Which is a tad on the irony side, considering Donald Trump's regime is also currently facing civil unrest due to his authoritarian police forces killing civilians. But I guess that's just the world we live in. That being said, although the hyperinflation that initially started these protests was largely caused by Western sanctions, you don't go from happy, peaceful, content, loyal population to full-scale revolution overnight due to one bad fiscal year. These protests are the result of several decades worth of outrage and uproar and violently crushed civil unrest as a response to an extremely religiously conservative authoritarian regime. So exactly how did Iran get to where it is as of right now? That's what we're going to examine in this video. It's going to be long and it's going to be nuanced, so if you're one of those people that likes a very black and white, good guy versus bad guy interpretation of reality, you're probably going to be upset with me during the course of this video. I want you to know in advance that I don't care. I don't care how upset you are that I didn't unequivocally take the side that you think is the good guy side, and I don't care about the emotionally charged, prepackaged political rhetoric you're going to try to use to shame me into obeying your narrative. You can leave it in the comments if you must, but know that you're wasting your time. However, I'm not an expert and I'm not an historian. I can and I will get things wrong. So if you have useful and pertinent information I might have missed, if you have meaningful discourse you'd like to contribute, please do. We like those things here. So basically what seems to have happened is after the First World War, the Russians and the British kind of divvied up Iran between them in classic neo-colonial fashion, and then immediately started squabbling with each other for dominance of the region with absolutely no concern for the well-being of the Iranian people whatsoever. In the 1920s, with the assistance of the British, a military colonel named Reza Khan took power through a military coup and installed himself on the throne as the new Shah. Now, the new Shah, formerly Reza Khan, now renamed Reza Shah Pahlavi, was succeeded by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Now, the Pahlavi dynasty was largely seen by critics as a mere puppet regime working in favor of Western interests, originally British and then eventually American, which was quite obviously true. For instance, at the time, the Iranian oil industry provided 1/5 of the entire global oil supply, and the British were taking 84% of the proceeds, which means Iran was only getting 16% of its own oil money. Now, the Shah regime didn't only have an extremely pro-Western attitude from an economic perspective, but also from a cultural perspective. Essentially, they kind of engaged in an aggressive, forced cultural westernization of their own people, which ended up having quite a hostile attitude towards some pre-existing cultural ideologies, specifically Islam. They were very anti-Islam, going so far as to ban things like hijabs and religious headwear, and having an openly disdainful attitude towards religion and religious leaders who did, after all, represent the beliefs of a significant portion of their own population. Now, this attitude kind of caused anti-Western ideology and pro-religious conservative ideology to intertwine with each other. Religious leaders became the face of the opposition, and because of Western meddling, there was a lot of opposition. Now, the Shahs had prime ministers serving under them, much how the supreme leader today has a president serving under him. In the early 1950s, the Iranian people elected this guy, Mossadegh, which might be mispronouncing his name, but that's the best I can do. They elected him as prime minister. He was extremely popular in Iran, but not so much outside of Iran, because he wanted to do something that was extremely sinful from the perspective of Western economics. He wanted to nationalize the oil supply, which would mean taking away the United Kingdom's rather impressive 84% share and just having Iran own their own oil. I know, novel concept, right? Now, this prompted the British in a state of panic to recruit the Americans to help arm the Shah so he could perform a military coup on his own government, essentially ousting the very popular democratically elected prime minister and taking more authoritarian control of the Iranian government. And from that point on, the Americans kind of began to slowly take over as the major influencing power in the region, until eventually the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979, led by this guy who became the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. As a highly religiously conservative leader, Khomeini's attitude towards governance was God should be in charge. But when it came to determining exactly what God wanted, definitely he should be in charge, openly stating that as his government represented God, rebellion against his government was rebellion against God, which was blasphemy and therefore punishable by death. He also introduced the concept of unity of expression, essentially that Islam should not have a bunch of different interpretations and ideas, but should express a single unified interpretation. Specifically his interpretation, making it very, very difficult and dangerous not just for non-religious people or people of other religions, but also other Muslim clerics to challenge or contradict his interpretation of religious ideology. Essentially what he's done there is used the word of God to make himself in charge of the law, and then used the law to make himself in charge of the word of God. That's some top-tier dictatoring right there. The current supreme leader of Iran is Khomeini's successor, Khamenei. Now, if you ask the Islamic Republic regime, they will tell you that this very authoritarian, religiously conservative regime represents the will of the people. See, according to their own numbers, the practicing, believing Muslim population, who also specifically believes their interpretation of Islam as it relates to a modern legal system, is over 99% of the population. But other independent surveys done anonymously without the fear of repercussions have claimed that the practicing Muslim population might actually be as low as around 40%. Now, I'm sure the Islamic Republic would claim that these studies are just Western propaganda, just like the West would claim that the number of over 99% is clearly Islamic Republic propaganda. But the fact remains that the country's well-documented history of rebellion and discontent by the people being met with brutally violent response from the regime means that the the regime's extremely conservative, authoritarian worldview does not align with the worldview of a large portion of the population, whether practicing Muslim or not, particularly as it pertains to purity and morality. See, this is where the whole, oh, they're actually just the good guys suffering Western sanctions and Western propaganda tends to lose the lucidly minded people. There's nothing about taking ownership of your own wealth and resources that necessitates morality police. Mandatory hijabs, the forbidding of dancing or gymnastics, and perhaps most importantly, the implementation of the death penalty for things like homosexuality or sex outside of marriage. And also largely putting the burden of moral responsibility on women to maintain social purity by removing the temptation of themselves. Now, whatever you believe about moral purity as it pertains to whatever religion you believe in is your business. But when we get to a place where people who don't believe in that moral interpretation are forced to live under it, under threat of death, that's oppression. That's what it is. Especially if that ideology doesn't in fact represent the actual beliefs of a large portion of the population, which I think it very clearly doesn't. So there it is. That's where I stand, I guess. I don't like hearing people say that the people of Iran should not be opposing their very clearly oppressive regime on the grounds that their regime is the enemy of the Western regimes or the Israeli regimes who are also oppressive. Two wrongs don't make a fucking right. I also worry significantly about the potential outcome should Western powers be able to successfully manipulate this situation to unfold in their favor, which looks like it's going to take the form of trying to reinstate the heir of the Shahs. That's the chatter on the internet, right? To reinstate this guy, which will almost definitely end up being another puppet regime, which very likely could lead to more turmoil, more division, more dissent, more destabilization, more exploitation, and in 50 years from now, Iran could very likely find itself right back where they are today. But none of that inspires me to encourage Iranians to support or obey their current regime. If I were Iranian today, I feel with my whole heart that I would oppose the current regime. Now, ideally, what we'd like to see is Iran somehow find their way back to this. But like I said earlier in the video, I'm not an expert. I have no idea what the path to that would look like. I'm gonna finish this video with a point that I make quite often on this channel. There are no good guys on the geopolitical stage. Just because someone's the enemy of your enemy doesn't make them your friend. This is a game for monsters, made by monsters, played by monsters with monstrous tactics. We need to stop dichotomizing every issue into two and then trying to figure out which side is the good guy side. Basically just playing favorites with sociopaths. In my opinion, the priority should always be trying to work out what is actually in the best interests of the people and then trying to work together to find the best way to hold the sociopaths accountable and in check. Now, thank you for watching, if you are indeed still watching. Obviously, this is a gigantic subject and I've only covered a small fraction of it. There it is. There's my take for what it's worth.